Good afternoon. I am calling to order a special meeting of the Committee of the Whole. My name is Elizabeth Glidden, and I'm the chair of this committee. And I'm joined today by Council members Gordon, Cano, Reich, Bender, Council President Johnson, Yang, Quincy, Warsami, Goodman, Councilmember Fry, who just stepped away for a moment, and Councilmember Palmisano. I want to note that Councilmember Andrew Johnson would desire to be here, but he has been having some health issues that he is getting some treatment for, and so we wish him the best and know that he will be back as soon as he can, and he is paying careful attention. This is a meeting regarding our proposed municipal minimum wage ordinance. At our last meeting of the Committee of the Whole, at our last, I think, council meeting, we gave a direction to our city attorney in coordination with other departments to draft an ordinance to present to us and to the public to allow us then to have some further public discussion on of how to continue to evaluate the elements of the ordinance. And so I will ask our city attorney, or deputy city attorney, Eric Nilsson, if he would please step forward and introduce where we are at, and welcome.
Sure. Thank you, Councilmember Glidden, and good afternoon, council members. Eric Nilsson, Minneapolis City Attorney's Office, and I'm here to present the proposed minimum wage in response to your staff direction of a week and a half ago. So let's get right to it. Just to review, this was your staff direction, the elements of that staff direction. The council directed staff to draft an ordinance that was applicable to anyone who works in Minneapolis for any amount of time. The ordinance should have a universal wage level of $15 indexed to inflation. All workers would be subject to the minimum wage regardless of tips, consistent with state law. The council directed to include a 90-day training wage to youth under the age of 20 years, consistent with state law. There was a request for a tiered phase-in period that reaches $15 per hour 4 years after ordinance adoption for large business. So if an ordinance is adopted in 2017, that would be 2021. And then a longer phase-in period for small business with consideration for up to 3 tiers of business size. And then finally, just as with the sick and safe ordinance that was adopted last year, enforcement would be vested in the Minneapolis Civil Rights Department. So the draft ordinance that you have before you responds to this staff direction, and then there are other portions of the ordinance that are bracketed because they are indicative of policy decisions that you will have to make as a body going forward. So I would describe it more as an ordinance framework and certainly not a finished product at this point. First of all, the scope. There is a definition of employee and a definition of employer. We tried to track state law as much as possible throughout this ordinance, where it was where the staff direction was consistent with state law. The definition of employee tracks the state law definition, including the various exemptions under state law, and includes an exception for independent contractors and extended employment program workers. I'm not exactly familiar with the extended employment program worker concept, but it was an exception that was put into the sick and safe ordinance. Relates to the maintenance of employment for severely disabled individuals. As I understand it, it's a state-run program. Covered employers includes all employers except for the exceptions listed, which were the same exceptions included in the definition in the sick and safe ordinance. Oh, should note, as you're aware, the question of the extraterritorial reach of the sick and safe ordinance is at issue in the courts currently. Oral argument is scheduled for July 11th at the Court of Appeals. And so once that oral argument occurs, we would expect the decision no later than 90 days in terms of that. So there may be some guidance provided there, maybe not, with regard to the extraterritorial reach of that ordinance. But of course, there are some significant differences between that ordinance and this. In the sick and safe ordinance, there is the issue of accrual and where it's accrued and where you can use it. With the minimum wage ordinance, you're paid the wage where you work.
So, Mr. Nelson, I'm going to ask. I think if there's something in here that we didn't ask to happen, it would be great if you would maybe explain why. And I know that there is a reason why. We kind of heard that on the
Mhm.
sick time about why would these government units not be covered under the ordinance. And maybe you can tell us in your opinion why. And then Councilmember Gordon is also in queue for a question.
Sure. Councilmember Gordon, again, I was not entirely sure of the entire debate on the sick and safe ordinance, but in general, this relates to the ability of the levels of government to regulate one another. And in general, the city does not have the authority to regulate the activities of the federal government or of the state of Minnesota and state agencies. So that I think was largely the decision there.
Yeah, thank you. Councilmember Gordon.
Well, maybe you don't want to weigh into this necessarily, but it made me curious about employees of the University of Minnesota. Would that fall into these categories, or are we not sure? Are they considered state employees?
Councilmember Glidden, Councilmember Gordon, that's a great question. I might defer to the city attorney, Susan Siegel.
I just don't want to do anything that would jeopardize our future ability to perhaps have the authority over them, so speak carefully.
Madam Chair and Councilmember Gordon, there is an appellate state court decision that in fact it related to the scope of jurisdiction of our civil rights ordinance as applied to the University of Minnesota. And the court there said that the University of Minnesota is an agency of the state, albeit a special agency of the state, but that the city, at least for the purposes of our civil rights ordinance and other similar kinds of ordinances, does not have jurisdiction over it. There is a bit of an ongoing tussle between the city and the university on other grounds, but the University of Minnesota, we believe, based on this precedent, would need to be excluded from this ordinance.
Thank you.
Mr. Nelson.
Okay, thank you. The next slide, again, relates to the business tiers. And I know this is one of the most important topics to discuss. The staff direction requested that staff include two tiers, a large and small tier, with consideration of a possible third tier. I would note that in state law, state law makes a distinction between large and small, and it's based on an annual gross volume of sales. It's $500,000 in a year, which is the division between large and small. Based on the policy recommendations of staff and the direction, staff took the direction to mean looking into drawing a distinction between large and small based on number of employees in this case. And this is really a pure policy decision for you to make. I'll provide a little bit of guidance here. This is a chart that shows a business size breakdown in the aggregate in total for the city. There are a little over 300,000 employees. You can see that there are only 57 employers with greater than 500 employees, comprising only 1% of the total number of employers, but that also has the highest percentage of employees at 37%. The greatest number of employers, a little over 8,000, 83%, are in the 1 to 25 employee category. This just shows you that data in a little bit different format. This is examples of where if you drew the line based on number of employees between large and small at various levels, how many employees and workers you would capture. So at 250 employees, you would capture approximately half, 53% of the employees in the city. At 100, you would capture approximately 1/3, 36%. And at 50, you would capture approximately a quarter of employees. A little more industry specific. This is a chart that shows the food service industry, not including caterers, food service contractors, or mobile food services. If the line was drawn at 100 employees, you would capture 88% of the food service industry employees. At 50, you would capture 62%. And then here is the non-hospital healthcare breakdown, only including nursing care facilities, home health care facilities, assisted living, and other residential facilities. 100 would be 49%, and 50, 22%. And if there are any other types of data that you would like us to get in terms of breakdown, I think we could do that. We'd obviously need some time to do that, but could certainly respond. Continuing through the draft ordinance that's before you. Employment in Minneapolis. Work must be performed within the geographic boundaries of the city. I would note that in the draft, we included a provision that employees who are typically based outside the city who have occasion to work in the city in a particular week are subject to the ordinance if they work at least 2 hours in a week. We included this provision, one, because it is the most prevalent nexus type provision in all of the 51 other jurisdictions that we reviewed. 27 of the 51 jurisdictions include a 2 hour in 1 week employee nexus. And two, we also, based in part on the current legal challenge to the sick and safe ordinance, felt like there needed to be at least a minimal nexus present that we could rely on. I would note that it does not include those traveling through the city for work. Again, the division between what is a large business and a small business for purposes of a phase-in period and applicable wage rates. We included a provision that is based in part on the sick and safe ordinance provision regarding how one would determine business size. And so it is based on the average number of paid employees per week during the previous calendar year for existing businesses. And then for a new business, it would be based on the average number of paid employees per week during the first 90 days after the first employee began work. And that would include full-time, part-time, joint, or temporary employees in the count, regardless of whether they work in the city or not. So the staff direction directed that the ordinance include a ramp up for large business. However, that line might be drawn to $15 4 years after adoption. So that's 2021. So you'll see the suggested, and that is simply a suggested rates, ramped up to 15 by July 1st, 2021. I would note that the state minimum wage, which for a large business, again, is based on a different metric. It's not based on number of employees, but gross volume of sales, is for large businesses $9.50 per hour currently. On January 1st, 2018, that will index to inflation, so it will go up. It would go up before the suggested July 1st, 2018 date in the ordinance. It's tied to the inflation index in state law or 2.5%, whichever is less. So upon indexing on January 1, the maximum amount that it would go up to is $9.74. So if you compare $9.74 to the first increase in the ordinance of $10.50, that can give you an idea of where you might be headed. In looking generally at the small employer phase-in periods, for those that reach $15, ultimately, they generally fall between 4 and 7 years, and this was mentioned in Nuria's presentation. The spread between where you draw the line between large and small, the spread is typically 1 year in those jurisdictions that have that. So the California jurisdictions often have 5 for large business and 6 for small. The state of California has 6 for small, or 6 for large and 7 for small. And then there are others that have shorter periods as well, but the spread is typically 1 year. You could go more though. And then just again, noting current state law minimum wage for large of $9.50 and small is $7.75 to give you some context. Okay, the inflation index, it's bracketed in the ordinance as a determination to be made. And I'd just like to give you some guidance on that. The state index is measured by the implicit price deflator. And I include the exact language from the state law there. National data for personal consumption expenditures as determined by the United States Department of Commerce. I have absolutely no idea what that is. But I do know that the state of Minnesota is the only state in the country that uses the implicit price deflator. Other jurisdictions commonly use the Consumer Price Index. And I just would note that in Representative Ellison's bill, HR 15, introduced at the end of May regarding the federal minimum wage, an inflation index is included in that bill of the annual percentage increase in the median hourly wage of all employees as determined by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So I would allow those with greater economic minds than mine certainly to opine on some of the advantages and disadvantages of these and what might be the best. But those are some guidance for you. Okay, again, in response to the staff direction, the ordinance includes a training wage for employees under the age of 20 that largely tracks state law. The language says that during the first 90 days in any calendar year, that employee must be paid at least 85% of the minimum wage rate rounded to the nearest nickel. After the first 90 days in any calendar year, that employee must be paid at the applicable minimum wage rate. And then there is some protection that tracks the language exactly from state law, which talks about how no employer can displace an employee to hire another employee at the lower wage rate. So there are some protections built in. If there was a disingenuous employer who tried to do some maneuvers to keep an employee at that lower rate. The language on tips, this language tracks state law exactly. No employer may directly or indirectly credit, apply, or utilize gratuities towards payment of the minimum wage set by this article. Enforcement. The good news is enforcement, as with sick and safe, is also here being vested in the Civil Rights Department. And the Civil Rights Department, under the leadership of Velma Corbel, has been hard at work creating that enforcement mechanism and that process. It's an administrative process through the department with the right of appeal to an administrative hearing officer. The rulemaking authority is also vested in the Civil Rights Department, just as it was with the Sick and Safe Ordinance. And there is a provision in the enforcement part of the draft ordinance before you that notes that the rules for the minimum wage ordinance shall be published 90 days in advance of the first scheduled minimum wage rate increase in the ordinance, whenever that might occur. And then the remedies and relief in the ordinance largely mirror the remedies and relief in the state minimum wage law. There was no analog with the sick and safe ordinance with a state law that we could model that portion after. And with minimum wage there is, and so they largely mirror the state minimum wage law. These are the relief available in the ordinance, and you can see that how they track. I'll highlight in particular a violation of the retaliation provision, which is the second bullet from the bottom, with payment of a fine of not less than $700 nor more than $3,000 for each violation, including reimbursement to the department of their enforcement costs as well. The notice and posting requirement is exactly the same as the sick and safe ordinance. And so you can see that here. It includes the availability in all languages spoken by more than 5% of the workforce in the city. There's a penalty for violation of that provision as well. The employer records provision largely mirrors the sick and safe provision. There's a retention of 3 years from the date the hours were worked, and the employer must allow the employee to inspect records required by the article. Also noting that the department has the investigatory powers to request those records and have access to those records. Retaliation prohibited. This is the provision that I mentioned previously, and this does mirror the sick and safe ordinance provision. And then finally, there's a provision regarding an annual report, starting in this case in 2019, by the Civil Rights Department regarding the implementation and enforcement of the ordinance. One of the dates in there coincide with the dates of the reporting requirement for the sick and safe ordinance, so that there's some similar dates there that they can work with. And it also includes a request for some economic data that's noted at the end. That was a provision that was actually taken in part from the Los Angeles City Ordinance. Noting the report may also include recommendations for possible improvements to the article. And again, this is set up as Article 4 in Chapter 40. The first 3 articles are that comprise the Sick and Safe Ordinance, and Article 4 would be the Municipal Minimum Wage Ordinance. And with that, I conclude and stand for questions.
Are there general questions for our city attorney? I'm not seeing any right now. So I might just do some things to kind of kick off the discussion. When we gave some direction to the city attorney, I think, just in all honesty, I think that we thought that the city attorney was going to make a proposal back to us, and then we would have some public discussion of that. And then you told us very fairly that you believed that some of the remaining questions, there was not perhaps a data-driven right answer, so to speak, and these were really policy discussions, and we just needed to find a way to have our own discussion of that. And so I just wanted to say that in public, because I think some council members had thought the city attorney would make that presentation to us, and then we would have discussion of whether we agreed with that proposal or not. Another thing that one of my colleagues did say to me today, I think it was Councilmember Reich, is a question, which I think is a fair question too for us, of whether we need to fill in these blanks or whether we just continue to take input or not. And so I think that's something that philosophically we could maybe have a difference of opinion on. And again, I don't think there's any perfect right answer for that. I think traditionally we usually have a fully filled out ordinance, and the purpose of that would be so that people can react to that, and we get that additional input at our public hearing or at other processes, and then if there are additional modifications that we make that. So I'll just say, knowing that, I have a proposal. I don't think it's a, it's a proposal for discussion. I have forwarded it to those on the dais, and I think there might be some extra copies that made their way up to the edge, and I'm not sure if there are other additional copies. And just a couple comments before I describe what the proposal is I will say I feel like even though this seems like the most, or it is perhaps the part of the conversation where we honestly just have some differences, legitimate differences of opinion on the council, I personally feel like we're in a pretty close zone of what we think the phase-in should look like and feel like. And I say that based on other public comments that council members have made at some of our other recent meetings. And so I just want to say thank you to my colleagues for being part of the discussion. I'll also say probably the person I have had the most discussion with is Councilmember Fry, and I really respect his opinion, and I think we're trying very hard to find, did we have where we would get exactly on the same page, and we just were close to each other, but maybe not exactly in that spot. So I just want to say I really respect Councilmember Fry's opinion, and in the end, I just felt that this was a conversation we just had to put out for public discussion, and we'll kind of see where it ends up landing today. This is not the last time we are going to be able to give direction or make a change to this ordinance. In reality, this is perhaps the first time that we're maybe making any adjustment, and again, fully filling in the blanks if in fact we vote to do that today. This will not be actually amending the ordinance. This would probably be, again, giving a staff direction to our city attorney with more specificity so that any blanks in the ordinance can be filled in, and then asking them to publish that as soon as possible so that whatever that product is then available to the general public. And we will be able to get comment on that comes back to us at the public hearing. scheduled for June 22nd. So in my original motion that I made to give direction to staff, I had made a proposal for a 5-year phase-in. The council at that time made an amendment to that, and we did not really have a lot of discussion of that amendment, and the amendment was that we should start the phase-in at 4 years. I think Councilmember Gordon made that amendment. So I just want to acknowledge that and say, I have made a proposal, and it is, again, about a 5-year phase-in. The proposal, and I'll read this language, is to ask the city attorney to prepare ordinance language that includes a phase-in period for large business, defined as employers that employ greater than 100 employees, and for smaller businesses, defined as employers that employ 100 or fewer employees, with steps, and then I describe some steps. What the proposal does is it phases in both large and small business to come to a full wage of $15 an hour by July 1st of 2022, which is within 5 years. However, the proposal would front load increases so there would be larger increases for the larger business size in the earlier years. And the smaller businesses would have much smaller increases in the earlier years and a larger increase at the tail end. So that was, again, a way to try to accommodate perhaps different capabilities of those businesses, again, using size as a differentiator, which is a little bit not always the perfect differentiator, but it's kind of, I think, the best we can do in the city to try to accommodate those differences. I'll say maybe just a couple more comments, and then my guess is that there will be some discussion, and I don't know if others may have some amendments or different changes that they want to try to propose. But I did ask our deputy city coordinator, Nuria Rivera Vandermeid, to help me with understanding the other jurisdictions that have to date done some sort of increase in the minimum wage. That includes primarily cities, but some states, as well as a few counties, maybe 6 counties, I think in all. There are 51 jurisdictions that have increased the wage. Of those jurisdictions, the majority, I think a little bit more than 2/3, have chosen to not have a different tiering or different way that you get to the ultimate wage, that they have all businesses on more of a uniform, let's get to the same year at the same time schedule. So I'll just note that that is something not all jurisdictions, but a good number of jurisdictions has said that they think is an effective way as a policy decision to make these changes. So I thought that was something that was important to me. Getting to a wage rate that has some uniformity around when you get to the 15, I thought was also helpful, both for employers to understand they have some responsibility in the key increase years, but also for employees to understand when the wage is increasing. And the last thing that I will say is that we have heard quite a lot from the small business community over, I would say, in increasing amounts in the last year and a half about think carefully about how to provide assistance and make sure it's assistance that we can kind of grab onto. What are those things that are going to provide a more tangible benefit? And I think that's what we have asked our staff in the coordinator's office to oversee. My belief is that we need to combine whatever we are doing here with a wage increase with targeting some additional ways to outreach to that smaller business community with more tangible assistance with how do you make sure you're able to have the business planning capability to think of how do you effectively increase wage and do some of those other things. So I'll just put that out there again as some things that I feel like I have heard. from businesses, and other people are hearing from other stakeholders, and that's just as important. So I will go ahead and make this motion. I will say the staff direction, joining me in making the staff direction is Council Members Bender and Warsami, and I am sure that there will be some discussion of this. I have a little queue started here. Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I said this last time, and I just think every time we talk about this, I want to stop and pause and note how important it is that the City Council of Minneapolis has such strong agreement that we are raising the minimum wage in the city to $15 an hour. And we should all feel really proud about the ways that we are leading as a city and the ways that as a council and policymakers we've been able to come together on consensus on a lot of the big questions about the ordinance. And I think really the credit, though, always goes to the workers and the advocates who've been asking for this policy and who have engaged so thoughtfully over years to help build the political and public support for raising the wage for workers in our city. I've also had so many thoughtful discussions with our business community over the past several years. I have over 400 licensed businesses alone in the 10th Ward. Many of them are owned by my constituents, and almost all would fall under a definition of small or medium-sized businesses. And so I've sat in pizza shops and restaurants and retail businesses over the last several years talking with my constituents and business owners about how our workplace policies are impacting businesses, and those have been very instructive. I don't pretend to know what it's like to run a business in our city, and I have been really I've learned a lot from those discussions. And one of the things that Councilmember Glidden just said that I really want to strongly echo, you know, my business owners have a lot of different perspectives about raising the wage in Minneapolis to $15 an hour. Some just really don't want us to do it. Others have a more nuanced perspective. A decent amount are actually paying close to 15 now, today. And so what I hear, though, universally is a need for our city to do more to support small businesses, outside of just the discussion of paid sick time or minimum wage or other workplace policies, that we really need to put our full support behind the new business office, the small business office that the council supported so much funding for last year, that we need to make sure that that's getting implemented meaningfully, that we're really sitting down with small businesses and hearing what are the creative ways that we as a city could put more resources and energy and time and working together with our business community to really highlight all of those things that are ways that we can lift up and support our small businesses. And so I think that's been a really important part of the discussion for me. As I've probably gone back and forth with many colleagues with maybe, 100 different versions of what our phasing could look like. And so I also think this was a starting point for our discussion. And one of the ways that I've started thinking about this, just because there's so many different factors, I tend to favor a policy that's simple as possible to communicate to workers and businesses, that's enforceable. And I think part of that simplicity is how do we tell workers and businesses what to expect? So if we start to get into too many tiers and fancy cutoffs and phasing, I get nervous that we're adding too much complexity to make our ordinance easy to understand and explain and therefore enforceable. I've wanted to prioritize getting as many workers as we can to $15 an hour with a relatively equal phasing. I have been open and interested in talking about what the phasing looks like for big versus small, but I haven't wanted to leave too many workers on that longer phase-in time. Because actually you get up to, as the presentation showed, it's pretty striking how fast you end up leaving behind 30% or 50% of our workforce if that number between big and small gets too high, and that's been very compelling for me. I mentioned briefly the smaller businesses. This proposal, of course, gets everyone to 15 within 5 years. And the way it's accommodated smaller businesses is to have that phasing start later, which is something we've heard from small businesses, that starting later part is really important. I've been open to having a longer time frame overall for small businesses, and I remain open to that discussion as we go forward and, again, hear more through the public hearing process before we vote on a final ordinance at the end of June. And then there's a couple things I wanted to note quickly, that enforcement is really important, and I think I appreciate the detail that the staff has put into this proposal. There may be other things that we can do to strengthen, and probably should do to strengthen the enforcement capabilities of our city around wages. Wage theft is a really big problem now in our city. And so we want to make sure that we are giving the city and workers adequate tools to make sure people are getting paid what they should be getting paid. And then the last note was about the youth wage. So I've gotten a lot of contacts about this. I just haven't had, we've been pretty focused on kind of getting this overall phasing correct. So I really do want to talk more with staff about how they arrived at the proposal they have now. And I voiced some concerns about, I just want to make sure that the current proposal doesn't end up being essentially kind of a loophole that leaves youth workers behind. I still tend to favor one fair flat wage for all workers. And again, don't want to make assumptions about why someone is working or why they need a job and what they're using the income for. So I just wanted to explain a bit about my thinking, just because this proposal here, which I was happy to co-author, is one of many that I've discussed with lots of council members over time. And those are the things that I'm thinking about and open to. And again, just want to thank all of the businesses and constituents and workers advocates who've gotten us this far in the discussion.
Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the staff direction. I have to say, when the ordinance came out with the 4-year timeline, I appreciated seeing that and seeing how we could get people to make at least $15 an hour within 4 years. I know that the ordinance was silent on what's a small or a large business, so it was hard to imagine how many would actually be left out of that, depending on how we define large business. So the fact that 100% under the staff direction before us now would be covered within 5 years has a plus, even if it means that no one will get to 15 within 4 years. I was just trying to get out my calculator here, and I was looking at, and so that means instead of on July 1, 2021, getting to $15 an hour, the people in the tier 1 large businesses would get to $14.25 an hour. So $14.25 an hour means they'll be losing maybe $30 a week, and so that probably means hundreds of dollars a year that they won't get to because we're making this choice that they otherwise would get to. Of course, it's a big improvement from where they are now. So I've got my head around accepting 100% in 5 years, and that's the way I'm thinking of it, even though it means nobody's all the way there in 4 years. But that's better than if we had some waiting 6 or 7 years to get there. And I appreciate how the tier 2 sees the increases coming in later. It's also my understanding that this concept or idea has been vetted with some of our stakeholders, and it has some support coming from the community. And I think that's important to acknowledge out here. And if that's not true, I hope people will make sure that I find out about it after this meeting, if you have, because my understanding is that there was some discussion about this morning, and some key stakeholders came in around this, and that's significant to me as well. And that included business and labor representatives and others. The one thing that I think I'd be most interested in thinking about more carefully is where we make that cutoff. We saw some slides in the PowerPoint presentation of how many people we're talking about when we make a change at 100 versus 75 versus 50. I was really hoping and expecting we would get to the cutoff point after I had some discussions from our last meeting of 50, because that still leaves 25% of the workforce in those small businesses that will be lagging behind. So seeing the number of 100 employees as defined for small businesses seems like that's going to put a significant number behind. And I don't have the slide in front of me, but thousands of people will be behind. So that's I'm not going to propose that amendment right now, but I just thought I'd put that out there, that seems like an area where maybe we could make some improvement, is bring that down to 75 maybe, if we're not willing to go all the way down to 50. But I'll wait and listen to my colleagues and see if there's other thoughts and other input.
Councilmember Cano.
Thank you, Councilmember Glidden. So I wanted to say that, I've been really proud of the process that this piece of public policy has taken. I remember back in 2014 when my office first started convening internal meetings with some of our colleagues here and staff to talk about advancing this piece of legislation. And since then, this process has grown, gotten more robust, has gotten much more engagement from our community and all the different stakeholders that will be impacted by it. And just leading up until today, actually, when I did have a meeting with some of the organizations and groups working on this to talk about what would be presented here today. So I just want to say that I'm very proud of the process that we've put together because it's been so extensive and thoughtful and very meaningful for a lot of people in our community. I wanted to speak specifically about the amendment that I supported last week with Councilmember Gordon, which talked about making the phasing period for large businesses 4 years instead of 5. And of course, that comes from an impetus of, personally growing up in a low-income family. I grew up in a mobile home park and then had 5 people growing up in a one-bedroom home, and then was privileged enough to represent our Ninth Ward community, which is one of the most diverse communities in the entire city and also one of the most low-income. It's natural that someone like me would be the first to support 15 publicly back in 2014, the first to take a stance against any tip penalties. And so as such, I would prefer that this would read 4 years implementation because I know our families need this economic opportunity so much. And as I was meeting with some of the groups today, I just wanted to let them know that I would be supporting what would be presented here today because I wanted to respect the amount of work, expertise, and thinking that has gone behind this proposal that brings together a large group of interests and people and companies and businesses and livelihoods. And so while I would prefer that this would be a 4-year implementation phase for our large businesses, I will likely be supporting this moving forward because I acknowledge that so many different groups have come together to try to make this work for our city, to make our city better for both businesses and workers and overall for our one Minneapolis. So thanks to all who have been working really hard on this. I'm really excited to take a final vote, and I want to start talking about what we're going to do next.
Councilmember Frye?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am passing out an amendment to the staff direction, or perhaps it's just an additional staff direction that is focusing on the enforcement section related to private cause of action that I would like to move. I believe that the fastest way to lose faith in government is to implement laws that we can't enforce, and I want to make sure that every bit of this minimum wage ultimately, and regardless of what it looks like, is enforceable. And I can talk a little bit more extensively about the private cause of action, but broadly speaking, I do want to acknowledge how much work has gone into getting to this point. It's not like this happened overnight. It's not like this happened in the last week. This has happened over a period of a couple of years. And while people's opinions and calculations have shifted over time, I do think we are moving in the right direction right now. Cities are very much becoming the laboratory of democracy, especially at a time when we've got gridlock at state and federal legislatures, and we are in a position to act to help people. We are also in a position to act in a reasonable and thoughtful manner that accounts not just for uplifting business workers, but also for accounting for small and local businesses as well. And I'm really excited that we are moving in that direction. Now, as for the particular proposal on the table, I do appreciate working with Council Members Glidden, Bender, and Warsami on coming up with an ultimate proposal to put down. I think it's important that we have something on the table that people can comment on today. And while we only had this proposal in the last few hours, I do think it's important for both workers and businesses to comment on the logistics of it so that we can ultimately arrive at something that is functional for everyone. I will say that I thought and continue to think that there should be a different phase-in for small and local businesses than large corporations. I still believe that sitting here right now. We have a very rich small and local business community in our city. Small and local businesses of 6 or 8 or even 50 employees function dramatically different from entities that have storefronts throughout the entire country, hundreds and perhaps thousands of them. That is not the same dynamic, and I do think we need to account for that. And by the way, the proposal that was put forth, it's not as if it is dramatically more simple simply because they come to the same dollar figure at the same time. I mean, if you look at it, as of July 1st, we're at $11.25 for large, $10.25 for small. July 1st, 2019, $12.25 for large, $11.25 for small. July 1st, 2020, $13.25 for large, $12.25 for small. So there still is complexity to it. The question that I would only pose that we should be reviewing over the next several weeks is whether we should have a different finality, a different reaching that $15 period for large businesses than small. I do believe that we should have a faster phase-in for large businesses and a slower phase-in for small businesses. And although it is not accounted for in this ordinance, I still think it's necessary to put something down on the table, so I will be voting yes today. And we'll be listening to what both workers of large corporations, workers of small businesses, owners of small businesses, and owners of small corporations large corporations think in the next several weeks. And I do encourage every single one of us to really genuinely listen. Because, we are all capable of coming up with our own individualistic proposals that serve our own individualistic interest and rewards. But I do think we need to be looking out for the community as a whole, and that is really critical in serving a functional ordinance here. I think it's great we're at $15. And another thing that's important to recognize is there's been a whole lot of talk about $15. $15 is still not a life. And I think that's what we need to be striving towards now. So you should have a staff direction in front of you, Chair Glidden. I don't know if you want to add it to yours, and I'll just serve as a co-author, or if I do mine separately, I'm fine either way.
Since Councilmember Fry moved this, I wonder if we can just see if we can, I'm going to kind of look around because this is our flexibility here, if we could just amend it onto the larger staff direction, if that seems all right with colleagues. I'll kind of look around. If people want to vote on it separately, we can certainly do that. So let's then have in front of us Councilmember Fry's amendment to add language asking staff to draft an ordinance section that would provide for a private right of action. Any discussion on Councilmember Fry's amended language? I don't see that. I'll just say that I certainly support this, and I really appreciate Councilmember Fry bringing this forward. My understanding from reviews of other ordinances around the country, again, is that this is, I'm not sure there's even another jurisdiction, maybe there's one or two, almost all include a private right of action. So this is sort of one of the fundamentals, I think, that other jurisdictions have included to ensure that enforcement can happen properly. So all in approval of Councilmember Fry's amendment, say yes. Aye. Opposed? No. So that is approved and added to the longer staff direction. Council President Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate, again, to echo my colleagues and people in our staff that have worked on this issue, the work that's gone into trying to create a product that is well accepted and we can all celebrate raising the minimum wage in our city. I am somewhat concerned about moving forward with the staff direction. It's sort of like we get it on paper and now that number is fixed, and then you look, if you want to change something, you look, people are taking shots and arrows fly and all that kind of thing. So I'm just a little reluctant about that because I was presented with this idea at 1 o'clock this afternoon. And, as someone who has really a relatively small number of businesses in my ward, the people that I have heard most from actually are small business. And, I think we can assuage our consciences as a city by talking a lot about how we're concerned about small businesses and how we want to treat them and respect them. And last budget we added 2 positions to work as small business navigators in the city. But we've done some things to them that we should be concerned about. We've I'll just give a few. Since we banned styrofoam, which all the little small restaurants made them increase their costs for the takeout food that they have. We've told convenience stores, if you could see the list of products that convenience stores have to carry, it's about a 3-page list of what convenience stores have to sell. They can't sell white rice. They only can sell brown rice. They can only sell this kind of beans, not that kind of beans. We banned plastic bags, but I guess the legislature told them we couldn't do that. But can't sell flavored cigars, and all of these. We've done all of these for reasons that are important. But I think we have to think about what we've done, and not think that we're not impacting small businesses, and we've made it all good by putting 2 navigators in place to deal with the issues that a lot of it we've created ourselves. So I also look at this phase-in of small business, and it goes to what Councilmember Fry was saying. This last jump for small businesses, if we do it the way that's been suggested as this matrix shows, does what essentially a contract for deed does, which is give them a great big balloon at the end. They have to absorb a great big increase to get them up to $15 at the end of that 5 years, and that's going to be a challenge for them. While I'm fine to have this in front of us, I just really want us to think seriously about the challenges that small businesses face in this community. That we're doing the right thing by raising the minimum wage, but I also think we really have to be careful and thoughtful about how we stage this, and adding a big balloon at the end for small business is, I think, a real challenge for them. What did I see in our numbers? We're 88% of the people in food service are who work for employers that employ less than 100 employees. So 88% of the people in food service are going to have to kick that balloon in at the tail end, the employer, and that's going to be a challenge for them. 49% of the healthcare people, although I did hear today from some of the healthcare people that reimbursement rates have been increased, and a lot of their wages are in the healthcare outside of hospitals, that their wages are on par with what we're suggesting for in the ordinance. So that gives me some comfort. I was concerned that we might be just adding patient load to people who have a really hard job already. So I'm happy to have this out in front of us, but again, I am not satisfied with having small businesses be impacted in the exact same way at the end of the ordinance as big businesses are. That really is not fair to me.
Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you. I see the staff direction. Well, first of all, I'll note that nobody seemed to be very interested in my wonderful bait that I put out there about lowering it to 75 or 50. So I'll let that go at this point, and I guess the cutoff's at 100. It seems like most people are satisfied with that. I do see that the Tier 2 does take a more gentle approach with the smaller businesses, though, and I did want to just acknowledge that I also noticed that balloon at the end. And one of the things that I thought about is that with the time we're in 2020 and 2021, we might see a lot of difference in terms of the market and the wages. There might actually be enough time for the council, whoever's here at that point, to evaluate and look at that. I think in all likelihood, there'll be pressure on, from the market and from potential employees, that wages might even have to be higher just to attract people. And I've already heard of a lot of people who are already paying more than they expected they might have a couple years ago, just so they can have good people working for them. So we may find that by 2021, a lot of people are already well above the 13.25 an hour working in Minneapolis, and maybe everybody. But it also gives us some chance to look at that again in the future if it looks like somehow that payment is, that last year is a big a balloon payment. I have a hunch that a lot of the businesses will be in sync with one another by then and all approaching 15 together, but we'll have to see. I think it will be good to have ordinance language that's firmed up before we go into the public hearing too, so we can potentially discuss that and hear people's input from it and make amendments to it. So I heard a lot of consensus with passing this and moving forward.
Councilmember Reich.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Obviously, this is being stated as a placeholder to get the process moving forward. And that's, I think we understand that. We work with procedure on a daily basis. But I think it's very important to make sure that we communicate to the public that that's just what it is. It could have very well an appearance based on our discussion that we're making up our minds in advance of final public hearing. And I want to make sure that we communicate to every corner of the city and to every stakeholder group that their public hearing is a real process. It's the real deal. And clearly there's not 100% consensus on how we get to our wage increase. There is obvious commitment on the DS here to move forward, but the how is still in question, even though there's a lot of proximity, as Councilmember Glidden has pointed out. But nonetheless, there should be room for conversation, debate, and discussion. I say this in light of one of the constituents I have that served on the advisory group, just resigned, with a sense of not being heard. Rightly or wrongly, I'm not judging her opinion on this, but we don't want that to be a prevailing sentiment moving forward. We want the stakeholders to be here, we want them making comment, and we want them to have a sense that they're being heard. And today is just a placeholder motion.
Thank you, Councilmember Reich. And I don't see any further, one more, Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to thank you for your leadership in getting us to this point in our discussions and my own personal discussions with council members. I think we're really close, but there wasn't like one obvious thing to bring today, and I'm really grateful that you were able to get something that is a good starting point for us to have, as Councilmember Reich just said, the public discussion that we were planning to have. And I hope council members will dig in and get engaged in those details, because they're really important, and it is difficult to work it out all at the last minute. So we do have some time here to get more involved.
Thank you, Councilmember Bender. So I'm not seeing any further comment. I'll just kind of maybe go back to reiterate a couple things I said before. One is that I do think council members had thought we would have a proposal from staff and discuss it. And so I just want to acknowledge again, that was kind of the place I think some of my colleagues were coming from. And so I really appreciate the thoughtfulness with which council members are trying to send a message to stakeholders that we appreciate feedback. And clearly, at least from my perspective hearing this conversation, we do sound like we're kind of in this, we're in a zone, but we have a few differences of opinion. And I think that's where the public hearing process will help us to be able to iron out what may be these final details to satisfy some of the additional thoughts and concerns, some of which have been laid out here today. So again, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and then ask for a vote on the staff direction so we can ask our staff to proceed and draft some language that can again be presented to the public for comment. So all in approval, Councilmember Frye.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Does this vote include both staff directions?
Yes.
Thank
So my understanding is we have amended the staff direction with your language to be one full staff direction.
Okay, in that case, then I'll add my name.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Councilmember Frye. And with that, all in approval, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Any abstentions? All right. So that item has been approved. We've given direction to staff. I think with that, we have concluded with the business that was on our agenda for today, and we are adjourned. Thank you.